The courtroom was silent, almost unnaturally so, as the judge carefully slid open the sealed envelope and began reading the contents of my father's will aloud, her voice crisp and steady, slicing through the heavy tension in the room like a scalpel. The air felt electric, thick with expectation and confusion. Papers rustled softly, someone cleared their throat. But all I could hear was the thunderous pounding of my own heart. I sat motionless, my fingers clenched tightly around the edge of the table, as if bracing myself for a storm. Across from me sat Marcus Chen, my husband, or rather, the man I had once believed to be my husband in every sense of the word. His bespoke suit hugged his body perfectly. His tie knotted with surgical precision, and that ever-present smug smile curled on his lips, as if he were already celebrating his victory. He leaned back in his chair with a confidence that made my skin crawl, arms crossed loosely like a man who believed he held all the cards. And why wouldn't he? For the past 3 years, Marcus had played the part of the successful, loving husband, while slowly, methodically, erasing me. To the outside world, we were a power couple. He, the golden boy of investment banking with family money and Ivy League polish. Me, the quiet, supportive wife with a modest background and a passion for teaching. We met at a charity gala, a glittering, wine-soaked evening where he'd swooped in like a knight from some warped fairy tale. I was vulnerable, grieving the loss of my father, trying to keep my head above water as a high school English teacher. He dazzled me. Expensive dinners, surprise vacations, jewelry I never asked for. Within 6 months, he proposed with a ring the size of my self-doubt, and I said yes, believing I'd finally found someone who saw me, someone who loved me. But Marcus didn't love me. He loved the idea of me, of owning me, molding me, silencing me. It started small. "It's cute that you want to help kids," he'd say with a condescending chuckle whenever I talked about my students. "You're such a bleeding heart." When I shared their successes, he'd nod absently, distracted, as if nothing I said ever really mattered. He dismissed my dreams of becoming a school principal as unnecessary stress. "Why bother?" he'd ask, patting my head like I was a child. "I make more than enough for both of us." And for a time I believed him. I confused control for care, but the mask slipped more each day. At dinner parties, when his colleagues asked what I did, he'd respond with a smirk, "Oh, Sarah's just a teacher, keeps her busy while I handle the important stuff." Just a teacher. Those words echoed through my bones. The way he spoke made me feel like a prop, pleasant, harmless, unimportant. When I'd try to chime in on conversations about politics or finance, he'd wave me off with a casual, "Sweetheart, let the adults talk." Laughter would follow, hollow and sharp, and I'd excuse myself to the kitchen, pretending to clean while swallowing my humiliation. And yet, none of it hurt as much as the way he spoke about my father. My dad was a humble man, a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant who raised me alone after my mother died. He worked double shifts to pay my tuition, fixed my car when it broke down, and called me every Sunday until the day he couldn't. He didn't have money, but he had integrity, and he loved me with a quiet fierceness that shaped every part of who I became. Marcus, on the other hand, never missed an opportunity to remind me of my blue-collar roots. "Not everyone can be born into success, babe," he'd say with a faux, sympathetic shrug. "At least you made it out of that life." When I got emotional on the anniversary of my father's death, he'd roll his eyes and mutter, "You've got to move on, Sarah. Grief doesn't change your past." But my father's past, our past, had built me. His sacrifices were the foundation beneath every accomplishment I had. Marcus couldn't see that, or maybe he did, and that's what made him resent me. As the second year of our marriage dragged on, Marcus's coldness calcified. He started staying out later, offering vague explanations about client dinners or emergency meetings. His phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now guarded like a weapon. Notifications came at all hours, and when I'd reach for it, even just to move it aside, he'd snatch it like I was the intruder. The romantic gestures vanished, replaced by silence and passive aggression. He stopped touching me, stopped listening, stopped pretending. I still wore the mask of the content wife, but inside, I was unraveling. I found solace at school, tutoring late, running clubs, pouring myself into my students. They were the only ones who reminded me that I mattered. When Maria, one of my seniors, hugged me and said, "Miss Sarah, you changed my life," I nearly cried. In their eyes, I was strong. At home, I was invisible. Marcus had spent years chipping away at my self-worth, convincing me that no one else would ever want me, that I was lucky he chose me. "You should be grateful," he said once, "that someone like me saw something in someone like you." And for too long, I believed him. Then came the night everything shattered. I came home from a long day at a parent-teacher conference feeling proud. I'd helped a struggling student's family build a learning plan, and they'd left hopeful. I couldn't wait to tell Marcus, to feel, for once, like I was sharing something that mattered. His study door was slightly ajar, light spilling out. I approached quietly, smiling, only to hear him laugh, low, cruel, unfamiliar. "Trust me, David," he said into his phone. "She has no clue. She's so naive, it's almost cute. She thinks I married her for love." My blood ran cold. Of course I had her sign a prenup. When we divorce, she'll get nothing. Meanwhile, I walk away with the house, the accounts, even that land her daddy left her. She doesn't even know what she gave up. Silence. Then more laughter. "It's been easy, man. A few gifts, some sweet talk, and she handed it all over. Honestly, I deserve a damn Oscar for this performance. 3 years of pretending to love someone that boring, it'll all be worth it when I cash out." I stumbled back, my body numb, the room spinning. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. I lay awake that night beside the man who had just called me a joke to his friend, staring at the ceiling as he snored peacefully, dreaming of the empire he thought he'd built on my back. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in years. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, poring over our financial documents, legal papers, anything I could get my hands on. What I found was a horror show. Assets transferred, accounts restricted, documents I had signed blindly, trusting that the man I loved wouldn't screw me. The house was in his name. The mortgage, while jointly signed, used my father's land as collateral. Our joint accounts? He had total access, I had none. It was a slow-motion betrayal, orchestrated like a symphony, each note designed to strip me of everything I owned. A week later, he came home with flowers. Wine. He sat beside me on the couch with that fake concern in his eyes and said the words like he was reading from a well-rehearsed script. "Sarah, we need to talk. This isn't working. I think we should separate. Make it clean, easy. I've already spoken to my lawyer. There's a settlement ready. You'll be taken care of." He slid a manila folder across the coffee table like a goddamn magician revealing his final trick. I opened it with trembling hands, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "What about the house?" I asked. "It's in my name," he said casually. "But you'll get enough to find a new place, something comfortable." "And my father's land?" His smile faltered, just for a second. "Sarah, we've talked about this. It was collateral. It'll be sold to cover the debt." The gaslighting was almost impressive. I nodded, feigning compliance, and told him I needed time to think. That night, I didn't sleep. I studied every clause, every loophole, every poison line in that divorce agreement. He'd planned it all down to the decimal. If I signed, I'd be left with nothing, not even my father's memory. But what Marcus didn't know was that I had finally seen him for who he was, and I wasn't going to go down quietly. The next day, I found an attorney. Margaret Willis, sharp, fierce, no nonsense. She didn't sugarcoat things. "If you signed those documents, we have a steep uphill battle," she said. "But tell me more about the land." I told her about the property, how my father had left it to me, how Marcus said it wasn't worth much. She asked if I'd ever had it appraised. I hadn't. She raised an eyebrow and said quietly, "Let's start there. And Sarah, there's something else. Your father may have left behind more than you realize." I didn't dare hope. My father had been poor, kind, but broke. What could he possibly have left? But 2 weeks later, Margaret called and said something that made my knees buckle. "Sarah, sit down. That land? It sits on top of a major natural gas deposit. It's worth millions. And that's not all. Your father opened a trust account in your name. Smart investments, compound interest, dormant because the bank couldn't locate you under your married name. It now contains over $2 million. I clutched the phone in disbelief. My father, my sweet, quiet father, had been protecting me all along. And Marcus? Marcus had no idea, but he was about to find out. The silence that followed Judge Ramirez's final words felt like a bomb had dropped inside the courtroom. But the real explosion came not from sound, but from the violent shift in energy. The way every eye snapped to Marcus's face as he slowly stood up, rigid with disbelief, his fists clenching at his sides while his lawyer whispered furiously into his ear. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see me, not the meek schoolteacher he married, not the naive girl who trusted him with her father's legacy, but the woman who just took everything back that he stole. He had thought the company was his. He had believed the lawyers he paid under the table, the forged documents, the manipulation of my signature while I was hospitalized after that so-called accident would be enough to erase me. But what he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that my father had left me a final key, hidden in the very server Marcus had wiped clean. And when that key unlocked the original shareholder agreement, uploaded to a secure cloud vault, and timed to release the day the will was read, it didn't just restore my ownership. It burned his illusion to the ground. He stormed out without a word, his entourage trailing after him like rats escaping a sinking ship, and as I walked out minutes later, the hallway parted like the Red Sea, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, and me in the center of it all, not triumphant, but haunted, because what none of them knew was that this wasn't over. Marcus had lost the battle in court, yes, but I knew that man, knew the quiet brutality behind his charm, the way he smiled when he was about to destroy something. And he wouldn't just walk away, he would retaliate, not through lawyers or business deals, but through something colder, crueler, more personal. That night, back at the apartment I had moved into just weeks before, the security alarm blared at 3:27 a.m. The window wasn't broken, the door wasn't forced, but my father's watch, the one heirloom I wore to court, was gone from my nightstand. In its place was a single white lily, a message, a threat, and a declaration of war. I called Detective Lena Reyes the next morning, the only cop I ever trusted, and her voice turned cold when I described the flower. "That's not just a warning," she said. "That's his signature." I asked her what she meant, and after a long pause, she told me something I hadn't known. "You're not the first woman Marcus tried to erase." That was the moment my revenge turned into something bigger than me. This wasn't just about my father's company anymore. This was about the trail of broken women, silenced partners, and buried truths Marcus left behind. And I was going to dig up every single one. The storm outside mirrored the war building inside me. Thunder rolled over the skyline as I walked alone into the records archive on the 32nd floor, a place no one visited unless they were looking to bury something or resurrect it. The fluorescent lights flickered as I keyed in the override code. Marcus had once joked that this floor was the graveyard of inconvenient truths. He wasn't wrong. For hours I stood knee-deep in dust-covered boxes and forgotten files, each folder whispering fragments of crimes disguised as contracts. There were receipts of offshore transfers dated just before every major board decision, NDAs signed in the shaky hands of frightened young women, and worst of all, a black envelope labeled simply MJ. My initials. Inside were surveillance photos of me, hundreds, years worth, in restaurants, on vacations, even inside my private apartment, moments I'd thought were mine alone. My breath caught in my throat as the full horror crystallized. Marcus hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been tracking me, studying me, preparing for war long before I ever suspected. Suddenly, Every flash of paranoia I'd dismissed made cruel sense. Every misplaced item, every flicker in the cameras at home, every unexplained delay in my messages, all orchestrated. I collapsed against the metal cabinet, nausea rolling through me like poison. He had been preparing to erase me, not just ruin me. But why now? Why this war, after years of pretending to love me? And then I saw it, stapled behind a document titled Succession Plan Contingency Alpha. It was a legal brief authorizing the complete transfer of power to Marcus, effective upon proof of my mental unfitness or presumed death. The signatures were forged, the dates backdated, and even the psychiatrist listed was under investigation for malpractice. It was never about love. It was about power. I was a piece on his board, one he thought he could move, isolate, and ultimately sacrifice. But now, the queen was back on the table, and I wasn't playing to survive. I was playing to win. I took every file, every image, every whispered ghost of truth, and locked it in a secure vault downtown, registering it under a pseudonym I hadn't used since my father's death, J. Arledge. It was the name I used the last time I went to war, in court, at 18, when I sued the very man who tried to claim my inheritance as his own. Now, history was bleeding into the present, and I realized Marcus wasn't my first monster. He was just the one who dared to wear a wedding ring while trying to destroy me. That night, Lena Reyes called me from a payphone. "You need to leave your apartment, now. They're watching you. And it's not just Marcus anymore." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed only what mattered: the original envelope from my father, the USB stick, and the last photo I had of my mother, the woman whose silence still echoed in my bones. As I stepped into the rain-soaked street, blending into a world that no longer recognized the woman I'd become, I made a vow. If Marcus wanted war, he'd get it. But not the kind he expected. This time, I wouldn't fight with lawyers. I'd fight with the truth, and truth, when sharpened, cuts deeper than any blade. I didn't sleep that night. Sleep was a luxury for people whose lives weren't unraveling in real time. I spent the hours pacing Lena's cramped studio apartment, the blinds drawn shut, every creak of the hallway sending my heart slamming against my ribs. Lena sat across from me, barefoot, chain-smoking, her eyes heavy with truth she wasn't ready to say out loud. She finally broke the silence around 4 a.m. "Marcus didn't start this, Maya. He's just the latest puppet. The hands pulling the strings? They've been at it long before either of you walked into that courtroom." I stared at her, unblinking. "What are you saying?" She flicked ash into a chipped mug. "I'm saying this goes back to the Halberd case. Your father's last trial, the one he was working on before his accident." My chest tightened. That word, accident, always felt like a lie. My father didn't make mistakes, and he didn't die by chance. I sat down slowly, my voice barely a whisper. "You told me that case was sealed." Lena nodded. "Because someone paid to bury it, paid a lot, and now they're trying to make sure it stays buried. Forever." She reached into a dented file box and pulled out a folder, yellowed with age. Inside were photos, testimony transcripts, a list of offshore accounts connected to a real estate shell company, the same company that had funneled money into Marcus's new tech acquisition. My fingers shook as I flipped through the evidence. This wasn't just about corporate power. This was about my father, his death, the trial he never got to finish. I was sitting on a bomb, and Marcus was just the detonator. "So what do we do?" I asked. Lena leaned in, her voice low. "We take it to the press. You still have the name of that journalist you saved in D.C., right? The one whose sister you got into witness protection?" I nodded. "Yes, Rafi Shah. Call him. Give him everything. You can't fight this alone anymore." But before I could reach for my phone, the building shook. A thunderous boom echoed outside, followed by the shattering of glass. Someone had firebombed a car out front. Not Lena's, not mine, but a warning all the same. We hit the floor instinctively, heartbeats racing like sirens in our ears. I crawled to the window and peered through the broken blinds. A figure stood across the street, black coat, face hidden, watching, then gone. Lena grabbed my arm. "We don't have time, Maya. They're not just watching now, they're hunting." We grabbed the files, a duffel bag with cash and burner phones, and escaped through the alley, disappearing into the bleeding edges of the city. The next 72 hours were a blur of coded calls, backroom meetings, and constant motion. Rafi agreed to meet in Baltimore, neutral ground. We rented a motel under fake names, and when he arrived, I saw in his eyes the same look I wore now, someone who knew too much and could never unknow it. I handed him the drive. "You'll be killed for this," he nodded grimly. "Then it must be worth printing." As he left, Lena turned to me. "You just gave away your last card." I shook my head. "No, that was the opening move. The real game begins now." That night I broke into Marcus's penthouse, not for revenge but for revelation. I knew he wouldn't be there. He was hosting a charity gala, all cameras and crocodile tears. But I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to be heard, later when the truth exploded on every screen in America. I planted a duplicate drive inside his private safe, marked with a single word: confession. Then I walked out, unseen, and watched from the rooftop across the street as the empire we built together began to crack from within. But Marcus didn't go down quietly. And the next morning, my name was on every news station. Not as a whistleblower, but as a fugitive. The morning after the courtroom's silence had etched itself into the walls of Sarah's apartment, she woke with a heaviness she couldn't shake. Her body felt cold even beneath the blankets, and her mouth tasted like metal, like she'd bitten through the truth and swallowed blood. The sunlight was pouring through the broken blinds, illuminating the scattered legal documents, coffee-stained papers, and post-it notes that covered her kitchen table like a battlefield of intentions. Her phone buzzed, 5 missed calls from her attorney, 1 from her sister Claire, and 2 unknown numbers she didn't dare return. But it was the voicemail from her sister that finally broke through her shell. "Sarah, you need to come to Mom's. It's about Dad's old journals. I think you were right. There's something wrong here." That sentence, "you were right," felt like a live wire against Sarah's skin. She threw on yesterday's jeans, barely laced her boots, and bolted out the door, not even bothering to check if she had her wallet. Claire lived just outside the city, in the kind of suburb that looked like a postcard. Neat lawns, red mailboxes, golden retrievers jogging alongside strollers. But when Sarah pulled into the driveway, Claire was already waiting on the porch, her face pale and her fingers trembling as she held out a thick, leather-bound journal like it was a ticking bomb. "This was hidden under a loose floorboard in Dad's study," Claire whispered, voice cracking. "It's not in his handwriting." Sarah took it in her hands and immediately recognized the penmanship. Delicate, precise, obsessive. It was their mother's. She flipped through the pages, and as the lines blurred into one another, the truth began to punch its way into her brain. Entries detailing hush payments, real estate shell companies, meetings with men whose names were synonymous with corruption. The man she thought she'd loved, the man she married, was mentioned. Marcus, always in code, but the connections were unmistakable. Her father hadn't just been a bystander, he'd orchestrated half of it. And when he realized his daughter might inherit it all, he started trying to bury the very trail that led to his crimes. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. Her mother had known. Her silence was the mortar holding the entire lie together. The room began to spin as Claire put a shaking hand on her shoulder. "There's more," she said. "I found emails. Mom was blackmailed. She didn't want any of this. She tried to stop it. Marcus threatened her." That name again. Marcus, the man who now smiled in courtrooms, who kissed reporters on the cheek and donated to children's hospitals while erasing families behind the scenes. Sarah grabbed the journal, stuffed it in her coat, and stormed out the door. The drive back was a blur of screeching tires, fists clenched on the steering wheel, and a mind spiraling toward revenge. By the time she reached her apartment, the sun had begun to set in the city, painting the sky a violent orange. She barely noticed as she sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time, kicked open her door, and dumped the journal on the kitchen table. She stared at it like it was a weapon. And it was. This wasn't just personal anymore. Marcus hadn't just betrayed her. He had threatened her mother, buried her father's crimes, and manipulated a courtroom full of strangers into believing he was the victim. But not anymore. Sarah's laptop flickered to life. She didn't call her lawyer. She didn't call Claire. Instead, she began uploading each page of the journal, scanning every entry, cross-referencing names, dates, accounts. She created an encrypted drive, duplicated the files, and sent one to a journalist she'd once taught in her AP English class, now working at a major investigative publication. She included a message. "You always said truth mattered more than anything. Here's your Pulitzer. Blow it up." Then she printed 2 copies of the journal and mailed one to the state attorney's office with no return address. By midnight, her apartment was dark, silent, and heavy with anticipation. The city outside was oblivious. Horns blared, taxis rushed by, lovers fought and reconciled in alleyways, but in that little apartment, a war was brewing. Sarah leaned back in her chair, eyes burning, chest pounding, not with fear, but with something new. Purpose. She wasn't just the girl betrayed by her husband anymore. She was the storm that was coming for him. And Marcus, wherever he was in his glass tower, had no idea the flood was already at his door. The silence in the hospital hallway was unnatural, like the hush before a bomb goes off. Maya sat beside her mother's bed, watching the fragile rise and fall of her chest, the beeping monitors like a cruel metronome counting down moments she could no longer afford to waste. The machines kept her mother alive, but only just, and in that sterile fluorescent light, Maya felt smaller than she ever had in a courtroom. Outside the glass wall, Raymond paced like a caged animal, phone glued to his ear, trying to negotiate something, anything with the insurance company, while Brielle stood with arms crossed, staring daggers into the empty corridor as if daring the universe to bring her more bad news. The room reeked of antiseptic and quiet despair. Maya's mind wasn't on the trial, not exactly, but the echoes of the last hearing followed her here like shadows she couldn't shake. She had broken ground in court, delivering a blow to the prosecution's credibility by exposing discrepancies in the surveillance timestamps, catching them off guard. But her momentary victory had been eclipsed by the sudden stroke that had brought her mother down in the middle of the courtroom steps. Now, Maya faced an impossible choice: prepare for the cross-examination that could turn the case entirely, or stay by her mother's side in what could be her final hours. She looked at her mother's hand, paper-thin skin stretched over brittle bones, and felt rage, grief, and guilt knot in her chest. She hadn't even had time to cry. She didn't have the luxury. Her mother had always said, "Justice is not a moment, it's a war." And right now, Maya was in the thick of it, and losing ground. When Raymond finally returned with dead eyes and empty hands, Maya stood up with mechanical resolve. "Tell Brielle to stay with her. I have to go back." Raymond's mouth opened, but she was already walking past him, past the antiseptic, past the helplessness, back into a world where her voice was the only weapon she had left. The courtroom felt colder than usual when she stepped back in, alone. The prosecutor smirked like a man who had tasted blood. "Miss Johnson," he began, "shall we pick up where we left off?" She met his eyes and gave the faintest nod, not betraying the fire she carried in her chest. This time, she wasn't just defending a client. She was defending a life, a legacy, a last promise made beside a hospital bed still warm. And nothing, not the judge, not the jury, not the smirking face of power in front of her, would stop her from delivering the truth now. Not anymore. The air in the courtroom crackled with tension as Maya stood, her voice steady, but her soul fraying at the seams. The prosecution came at her like a wolf sensing weakness, launching objection after objection, twisting words like blades, trying to push her off balance. But Maya held her ground, not because she felt strong, but because she had no choice. Each step she took in that courtroom was soaked in the weight of her mother's labored breathing, in the silent prayers echoing through sterile hospital walls. Every time she opened her mouth, she was speaking not just for her client, but for every woman told she couldn't win, for every poor soul crushed under the heel of injustice and silenced with paperwork. The opposing counsel tried to undermine her with cheap tricks, replaying distorted clips from the surveillance footage, insinuating that her client had lied under oath, sneering suggestions of motive. But Maya countered each point like a chess grandmaster who had nothing left to lose. Her cross-examination of Detective Keene was the turning point. She paced slowly in front of the witness stand, her heels echoing like drums of war, and with every question, she peeled back layers of negligence, showing how the detective had failed to follow basic procedures, how key evidence had been logged late, and how witness statements had been coerced through subtle threats. When she asked Keene to explain why a witness statement timestamped at 9:42 p.m. referred to an event that the CCTV proved didn't occur until 10:07, the courtroom went still. The silence was thunderous. Keene stammered. The jury leaned in. The prosecutor objected, but it was too late. The crack in their narrative had widened, and Maya drove her argument through it like a battering ram. That night, Maya didn't go to her apartment. She went straight to the hospital, where Brielle sat sleeping in a chair, and Raymond whispered. She opened her eyes for a few seconds. She asked for you. Maya collapsed beside the bed, her hands shaking, whispering apologies, hopes, regrets. Her mother's hand moved faintly, a tremor of life. Maya promised her then, through clenched teeth and hot tears, that she would win this case not just to save a client, but to change the system that had failed them again and again. She left the hospital at dawn, hollowed but burning with purpose. The next morning in court, when the prosecutor called Maya's client, a young woman named Imani, to the stand, expecting her to buckle, Maya rose like a storm. She stood beside her client, one hand gently on her shoulder, and told the court, "Today you will hear a truth no one wanted told, and when you hear it, you'll understand why they worked so hard to silence it." And when Imani began to speak, voice shaking but unwavering, the courtroom listened, really listened, for the first time. It was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about survival. It was about truth. The courtroom held its breath as Imani began to testify, not as a victim to be dissected or a defendant to be judged, but as a human being whose voice had long been denied. She spoke of that night not with drama, but with aching clarity. How she had called for help and no one had come. How she had tried to explain herself to the officers who burst in but was met only with barked commands and cold handcuffs. Her story unfolded like a wound reopening, and even the jury, hardened by weeks of procedural arguments and technical language, could not look away. One juror wiped away a tear. The judge leaned forward. Maya stood silently beside her, fists clenched behind her back, ready to object at the first sign of attack. But none came. Even the prosecutor seemed shaken, unsure how to proceed when the truth was so raw, so unfiltered, so damning. But the real bombshell came when Maya introduced a new witness, Alonzo Marks, a former janitor at the courthouse. He was an unremarkable man in appearance, but when he spoke, his testimony lit the room on fire. He had overheard a private conversation months earlier between two senior prosecutors discussing how the Imani case was to be used as a deterrent, how they needed to make an example out of her to clean up their reputation after mishandling a series of high-profile cases. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order, but the damage was done. Maya turned to the jury and said, "This is not justice, this is not law, this is politics, and my client was its collateral." That night, Maya didn't celebrate. She sat in the dark of her apartment, rereading old letters her mother had written during Maya's first years in law school. Letters filled with hope, pride, warnings. "Be careful not to lose yourself in their world," one line read, underlined 3 times. The next day, a media frenzy swirled outside the courthouse. Activists rallied, reporters clamored, politicians scrambled. Maya, now a reluctant symbol, refused interviews and focused on closing arguments. She stood before the jury with none of the theatrical flourishes that had marked other lawyers' speeches. Instead, she simply said, "You've heard the truth, and now you have to live with what you do next." Her voice did not tremble. The room was silent as she returned to her seat. As the jury left to deliberate, Maya walked past the prosecution table, locking eyes with ADA Caroline Winslow, the architect of the case, the woman who had smiled so politely while burying lives under red tape. For a brief second, Winslow looked unsure. Not angry, not confident, but exposed. When the jury returned 6 hours later, the room stood still. Maya's heart pounded, not for herself, but for the girl beside her who had endured so much. The verdict: not guilty. A sob escaped Imani's lips. Maya's knees nearly buckled. The courtroom erupted, but Maya remained still, blinking back tears, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. "You were born for more." As she stepped outside, camera flashes exploded like lightning, but Maya didn't flinch. She had walked through fire, and now she was the one holding the torch. In the weeks that followed the verdict, Maya Johnson became both a lightning rod and a lodestar, a name whispered in law schools, chanted in protests, and cursed in private government briefings. Imani's freedom, hard-won and fragile, became the spark that reignited conversations across the country about race, power, and the cost of silence. But Maya wasn't interested in fame. She declined speaking engagements, ignored book offers, and refused to be rebranded as a media figure. She returned to her small office, now overflowing with letters, some pleading for help, some threatening vengeance, some simply thanking her for making them feel seen. But the fight wasn't over. One rainy morning, a manila envelope arrived on her desk, hand-delivered, unmarked. Inside were internal memos, real names, real signatures, confirming everything Alonzo had said and more. Evidence suppression, targeted prosecutions, quotas dressed up as justice. It was a blueprint of systemic rot. Maya knew releasing it would cost her everything. Her license, her safety, maybe her life. But she also knew what silence would cost others. That night, as thunder rolled over the city, she stood alone in front of the courthouse steps, holding the documents in one hand, a flash drive in the other. The press had gathered. No advance notice, no statement. Just Maya standing in the storm, eyes burning with the quiet rage of someone who had nothing left to fear. "I didn't come here to make speeches," she said, voice low but steady. "I came to show you the truth." She handed the files to a reporter. Within hours, headlines erupted. Leaked memos reveal targeted prosecutorial corruption. Investigations launched. Resignations followed. A federal task force was formed. The courthouse where Imani had once been shackled now bore graffiti outside its gates. "Justice is not a building. Justice is a fight." Maya became a symbol not because she wanted to, but because she refused to be quiet. Late one night, weeks later, Imani knocked on her door, tears in her eyes but strength in her posture. She had enrolled in law school. She had decided to fight, not out of revenge, but because Maya had shown her what one voice could do. Maya hugged her without words. Two women who had been broken and rebuilt by a system meant to erase them now stood side by side, warriors born not in fire but in truth. And as the world turned, as the headlines faded, as other stories took the spotlight, one thing remained clear. Maya Johnson had changed the game, not with violence, not with vengeance, but with the relentless, unflinching power of truth. And the system would never be the same again. The rain had begun to fall harder in Washington by the time Maya Johnson stepped into the dimly lit hallway of the Justice Reform Council's temporary office, her breath catching slightly from the cold, but her mind already racing. The victory from the courthouse still echoed across national headlines, but in the shadows, in marble-clad boardrooms and men-only political retreats, retaliation was quietly taking shape. Maya knew this wasn't over. The message on her phone that morning, left unsigned but chillingly precise, had confirmed it. You exposed them. Now they expose you. At first, she brushed it off, an idle threat, an angry whisper from a crumbling empire. But as the day wore on, small details began to shift. Her car tires slashed. Imani's school record was flagged for review. Even Rachel Alvarez, the investigative journalist who risked her career to publish the sealed documents, received a subpoena to appear before a closed federal hearing. This wasn't backlash, it was war. And Maya, for all her strength in the courtroom, realized she was fighting something older, deeper, a system so embedded it bled into the walls of every institution she once believed in. Yet she refused to run. She gathered her team, Imani, Rachel, Elijah from the University Law Review, and Aisha from Civil Rights Watchdog PAC, in the back room of a non-profit office with flickering lights and broken heat, and laid out everything. Sealed files she'd been holding back for years, anonymous whistleblower letters dating back to her father's death, and a new target, Operation Echelon, a covert surveillance and intimidation program linked to the very prosecutors and judges they'd stood before. Imani, once a quiet observer in Maya's world, now stood toe-to-toe with her mentor, eyes fierce, spine steady. "Let them come," she said quietly. "But we hit first this time." That night they launched a counter-investigation, mapping shell companies, chasing unlisted bank transfers, exposing gag orders buried under national security exceptions. The deeper they dug, the darker it got. Former inmates started contacting Maya anonymously, sharing audio recordings of abuse, evidence of coerced confessions, and blackmail against public defenders. Maya pieced together what she had once feared was too dangerous to pursue. Her father's own work had uncovered Operation Echelon years ago, and he'd been silenced not by accident or bureaucracy, but by design. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was legacy. It was justice denied for a generation. And just as the walls began to close in, as the Department of Justice sent her a cease and desist letter, and social media bots flooded her inbox with threats, Maya stood outside the federal courthouse, this time not as a grieving daughter or betrayed widow, but as a warrior, her voice steadier than the storm brewing behind her. "They thought killing the truth would bury it," she told the cameras, "but it only taught us how to dig." Beside her, Imani pressed a hard drive into Rachel's hand, the final piece of evidence they needed. And somewhere in the shadows, someone watching knew. Maya Johnson was no longer a threat to be silenced. She was the reckoning they'd always feared was coming. The rain had begun to fall harder in Washington by the time Maya Johnson stepped into the dimly lit hallway of the Justice Reform Council's temporary office, her breath catching slightly from the cold, but her mind already racing. The victory from the courthouse still echoed across national headlines, but in the shadows, in marble-clad boardrooms and men-only political retreats, retaliation was quietly taking shape. Maya knew this wasn't over. The message on her phone that morning, left unsigned but chillingly precise, had confirmed it. You exposed them. Now they expose you. At first she brushed it off, an idle threat, an angry whisper from a crumbling empire. But as the day wore on, small details began to shift. Her car tires slashed. Imani's school record was flagged for review. Even Rachel Alvarez, the investigative journalist who risked her career to publish the sealed documents, received a subpoena to appear before a closed federal hearing. This wasn't backlash, it was war. And Maya, for all her strength in the courtroom, realized she was fighting something older, deeper, a system so embedded it bled into the walls of every institution she once believed in. Yet she refused to run. She gathered her team, Imani, Rachel, Elijah from the University Law Review, and Aisha from Civil Rights Watchdog PAC, in the back room of a non-profit office with flickering lights and broken heat, and laid out everything. Sealed files she'd been holding back for years, anonymous whistleblower letters dating back to her father's death, and a new target, Operation Echelon, a covert surveillance and intimidation program linked to the very prosecutors and judges they'd stood before. Imani, once a quiet observer in Maya's world, now stood toe-to-toe with her mentor, eyes fierce, spine steady. "Let them come," she said quietly, "but we hit first this time." That night, they launched a counter-investigation, mapping shell companies, chasing unlisted bank transfers, exposing gag orders buried under national security exceptions. The deeper they dug, the darker it got. Former inmates started contacting Maya anonymously, sharing audio recordings of abuse, evidence of coerced confessions, and blackmail against public defenders. Maya pieced together what she had once feared was too dangerous to pursue. Her father's own work had uncovered Operation Echelon years ago, and he'd been silenced not by accident or bureaucracy, but by design. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was legacy. It was justice denied for a generation. And just as the walls began to close in, as the Department of Justice sent her a cease and desist letter, and social media bots flooded her inbox with threats, Maya stood outside the federal courthouse, this time not as a grieving daughter or betrayed widow, but as a warrior, her voice steadier than the storm brewing behind her. "They thought killing the truth would bury it," she told the cameras, "but it only taught us how to dig." Beside her, Imani pressed a hard drive into Rachel's hand, the final piece of evidence they needed. And somewhere in the shadows, someone watching knew. Maya Johnson was no longer a threat to be silenced. She was the reckoning they'd always feared was coming. The courtroom was dead silent as Maya Johnson stepped through the massive oak doors of the Federal Grand Tribunal, the first such special session convened in over a decade, with rows of media, watchdogs, and political operatives packed into every crevice like vultures awaiting a spectacle or a sacrifice. Her black suit, crisply tailored, seemed to absorb the gravity of the moment, but it was her expression, calm, sharpened by sleepless nights and unrelenting purpose, that spoke volumes. She carried no notes. Everything she needed was burned into her bones. Operation Echelon had fallen, not by force, but exposure. The data Imani decrypted, the testimonies Rachel broadcast, the legal precedents Elijah resurrected. It all came together like the slow crescendo of a justice long delayed. But with it came danger. 3 whistleblowers had vanished. A federal judge implicated in the cover-up had committed suicide under suspicious circumstances. Maya herself had been placed under surveillance and subpoenaed for contempt after refusing to reveal sources. Yet here she stood, not testifying for defense or prosecution, but making a statement as the appointed special investigator under Article 12 emergency provisions. "This tribunal," she began, her voice low and measured, "is not about guilt or innocence in the abstract. It's about a nation's betrayal of its own soul." She laid out the timeline, how private prisons funneled money into judicial campaigns, how sentencing quotas had been enforced quietly through algorithmic bias, how defense attorneys were offered incentives to plea out innocent defendants. Names were named. Documents flashed on the screen behind her. A map revealed the racial skew of prison labor contracts. As her voice rose, the room began to shift, from skepticism to horror. Even hardened officials leaned forward, brows furrowed in disbelief. And then she did something no one expected. Maya turned the camera feed toward herself and held up a worn, creased photo. Her father in uniform, standing beside a file cabinet marked classified. "He tried to warn them," she said. "He died for this." The moment cracked the room open. It wasn't just about statistics or systems anymore. It was about blood. Legacy. The lives lost in silence. Imani, standing at the back, felt tears trace her jaw as the enormity landed. They had done what even giants feared to attempt. Over the next 5 hours, Maya answered every question, with clarity and conviction, refusing to be shaken by the federal prosecutor's icy interruptions or the corporate lawyer's smug insinuations. She ended her testimony with one line: "America must choose, reform or ruin." The tribunal recessed. For 3 days, the world waited. Outside, protesters camped in freezing rain while senators scrambled behind closed doors. Finally, the verdict came. Multiple indictments, emergency legislation, and the official dismantling of Operation Echelon. But that wasn't the end. In the weeks that followed, Maya declined multiple offers, book deals, cable shows, political campaigns. Instead, she founded the Justice Legacy Initiative, a nonprofit coalition to legally represent victims of systemic abuse and train the next generation of impact litigators. Imani became its first legal fellow, already preparing her own civil suits against corporations involved in inmate labor exploitation. Rachel's exposé won a Pulitzer. Elijah was appointed to the bench. And Maya visited her father's grave for the first time in years, alone, with a letter in her hand. She placed it beside his stone, whispered something only the wind could carry, and walked away without looking back. Because justice, once awakened, does not sleep again. It moves, like her, forward, relentless and eternal. It was early spring in Washington, the air still cold enough to sting but touched by the faintest scent of bloom, when Maya Johnson finally allowed herself to stop. Not to rest, but to breathe without urgency, to sit without surveillance, to live without looking over her shoulder. The world had not healed overnight. Operation Echelon's ashes still smoldered in the corners of government databases, and though indictments had been handed down and reforms signed with ceremonial pens, the machinery of injustice, slow, stubborn, deeply embedded, continued to resist. But something irreversible had begun. A shift in language, a refusal to forget. The Justice Legacy Initiative had grown faster than anyone anticipated, its small offices buzzing with young attorneys, data analysts, community organizers, and survivors turned advocates. Every morning, Maya walked past the mural painted across their lobby wall, a sweeping image of scales breaking apart, with hands catching the falling pieces, and felt a pulse of something like purpose, or maybe grace. Imani had become a rising star in federal litigation, but she remained Maya's closest collaborator, challenging her when needed, protecting her when necessary, and reminding her, with fierce loyalty, that the fight was not about fame. Elijah, now Judge Green, ran his courtroom like a citadel, fiercely independent, unbought, unwilling to tolerate procedural injustice. Rachel, now editor-in-chief of a rising investigative platform, continued exposing rot with a pen that cut deeper than steel. And Maya found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, teaching. Just one course once a week, at a small historically black law school, where she stood in front of 20 students and told the truth the way it deserved to be told. Unsanitized, unafraid, unflinching. She spoke of law not as an institution, but as a living force, something that could be corrupted or redeemed, something that required courage more than intelligence. And every time she looked at her students, hungry-eyed, exhausted, brave, she saw the seeds of the very revolution she had once been told was impossible. But the story didn't end there. One night, alone in her apartment, Maya found a box she had not opened in over a decade. Inside were the journals her father had kept, still coded in his strange half-military, half-poetic shorthand. She sat with them for hours, slowly decoding line after line. Maps of secret meetings, recordings of prison contract bids, letters he had never mailed. One in particular broke her open. Dated 2 weeks before his death, it read simply, "If I don't survive this, I pray someone braver will finish what I began. Maya, forgive me for making you carry this." She wept without shame. The next day, she filed a motion to officially reopen his case, not as a whistleblower gone rogue, but as a hero destroyed by the system he tried to stop. When the court ruled to exonerate him posthumously, Maya stood before a full courtroom, holding his photo. "This is not closure," she said. "It is correction." And when the gavel fell, she felt not triumph, but clarity. The weight of generations lifted just enough for the next step to become possible. Outside, children were chalking messages onto the courthouse steps. Truth matters. Justice is work. Maya was here. She smiled but didn't stop. There was still too much to do. In the months that followed, Maya traveled to communities broken by incarceration, to universities hungry for truth, to mothers whose sons had names only shouted in protest. In each place, she listened first, spoke later, and left behind the same challenge. Don't ask if change is possible, ask if you are willing to fight for it. And then, one rainy evening, years after her battle had become legend, Maya stood in the back of a packed courtroom, watching a young lawyer, a former student, deliver closing arguments in a wrongful imprisonment case that echoed Maya's own. The lawyer's voice trembled but held firm, and as the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, the gallery erupted. Maya didn't cheer. She just closed her eyes, because this quiet, righteous ripple, was what victory truly looked like. Not a headline, not a monument, but justice passed forward, hand to hand, like a torch. And somewhere deep inside her, the weight she had carried since childhood shifted again. Not gone, but shared. Finally, Maya Johnson walked out into the rain. No umbrella, no entourage. Just her and the sky, and the knowledge that somewhere, in the hearts of those she had reached, justice, real justice, what was no longer a dream, but a direction.